It begins with a photograph. A frozen smile from 1961. A teenage girl with sunlight in her hair and a woman whose gaze holds both pride and something unspoken. On the set of The Parent Trap, they look like every mother and daughter. America wanted to believe in Hayley Mills, the golden child of Disney, and Maureen O'Hara, the indomitable queen of Technicolor. 60 years later, Hayley sits in a quiet London room. At 79, her voice is slower, steadier, but carries the same luminous honesty that once filled cinema screens. She places that old photograph on the table and says, almost to herself, "She didn't just play my mother. She protected me from something I couldn't name back then." The air seems to still around her words. For decades, the world had believed in the fairy tale innocence of The Parent Trap, a film about reunion, laughter, and family. But beneath that laughter, there was the machinery of Hollywood in its most merciless form, a studio eager to preserve its perfect image, even if it meant sculpting childhood into performance. Hayley remembers the way the cameras never stopped the interviews, the rehearsals, the endless pressure to remain sweet, grateful, and flawless. You belong to the audience before you even belong to yourself, she whispers. And in that storm of attention, one adult stood quietly between her and the invisible currents of exploitation, Maureen O'Hara. O'Hara was fiery, elegant, impossible to ignore. On screen, she was the embodiment of grace and authority. Off screen, she was something rarer, a woman who understood the cost of fame and refused to let a child pay it. Now, after years of silence, Hayley Mills is finally ready to tell the truth about the woman the world thought they already knew. A truth about mentorship, defiance, and the unspoken bond between two actresses separated by a generation but joined by instinct. Who was Maureen O'Hara when the camera stopped rolling? And what exactly did she protect Hayley from the studios, the press, or something far deeper, the slow erasure of innocence under the bright, relentless light of fame? To understand what Hayley Mills means when she says Maureen O'Hara protected her, we must return to the early 1960 seconds, an era when Hollywood looked like a dream painted in Technicolor, but functioned more like a factory of illusions. The studio system had perfected the art of innocence. Disney, in particular, built its empire on the faces of bright, well-behaved children who smiled on command, spoke with perfect diction, and carried the burden of eternal wholesomeness. Hayley Mills was one of those faces. The daughter of British actor John Mills, she had been discovered at 12 and immediately cast in Pollyanna, the film that turned her into a symbol of unbreakable optimism. She was barely a teenager when she found herself trapped between two worlds, the disciplined elegance of British theater and the glossy, carefully choreographed warmth of American family cinema. Maureen O'Hara, by contrast, was a woman who had survived the full brutality of that same machine. Born in Dublin in 1920, she entered Hollywood when the color film was still a novelty and men still ran the studios like kingdoms. Her fiery red hair, captured by Technicolor, made her both a marvel and a target. She had fought off typecasting, intrusive journalists, and producers who mistook confidence for arrogance. By the time she stepped onto the Disney lot for The Parent Trap, she was no longer just an actress. She was a veteran warrior who had learned how to shield herself with dignity. Their meeting was not staged for publicity. It was chemistry born of contrast, youth, and experience, naivety and strength. Hayley would later recall that O'Hara never spoke to her like a child. She listened, asked questions, and insisted on truth even in small things. When Hayley stumbled on a line, O'Hara would lean in and whisper, "Don't act it. Feel it." It was advice that would shape Hayley's entire approach to performance and perhaps, to survival. On set, O'Hara was formidable but never cruel. She commanded respect without raising her voice. The crew adored her discipline. The director relied on her intuition. Yet, between takes, she would notice things others ignored: the fatigue behind Hayley's polite smile, the way the young actress flinched when publicists called her the new Shirley Temple. O'Hara recognized those signs. She had seen too many children lost in the glare of artificial adoration. The world, however, saw only perfection. The Parent Trap was marketed as a wholesome family fantasy, a film about love rediscovered, families reunited, and innocence preserved. The posters glowed with joy. Disney's marketing team pushed the narrative of a real-life bond between the co-stars, framing O'Hara as the cinematic mother every child wished for. For the audience, it was all comfort. For the actors, it was control. Inside the studio gates, Hayley learned that image management was as meticulous as lighting or costume. Public appearances were scheduled months in advance. Answers for interviews were scripted. Even her laughter had to sound sincere but not silly. There was a lesson whispered behind the glamour. Once you became an ideal, the real you ceased to matter. It was during this time that O'Hara began to draw subtle boundaries around the girl's life. She refused to let Hayley work late into the night, reminding producers that children are not machines. When reporters pressed too close with personal questions, she would interject smoothly, turning the focus back to the film. To the casual observer, it was professional courtesy. To Hayley, it was sanctuary. She would later say that O'Hara's protection came not from grand gestures, but from small, invisible acts. Shed put a hand on my shoulder when I didn't know I needed it, Hayley recalled. It was like she could sense the pressure before I could name it. There was one afternoon in particular, under the sharp California sun, when the camera stopped because Hayley could not deliver a line. She was exhausted. She had been smiling for hours, performing twin roles that demanded she react to herself on screen, a technical challenge even for adults. The director grew impatient. The crew shuffled. And then O'Hara quietly took charge. She called for a break, guided the girl to a shaded corner, and simply sat with her. No advice. No correction. Just presence. Later, when filming resumed, Hayley delivered the scene flawlessly. The director praised her. O'Hara said nothing, just smiled faintly, the kind of smile that tells a child, "You're safe now." In that moment, something changed between them. Hayley stopped seeing Maureen O'Hara as just her screen mother. She began to feel that strange, sacred tension that exists between admiration and gratitude, the kind that lingers long after the cameras stop. For O'Hara, the bond may have been instinctive. She had a daughter of her own, Bronwyn, and understood the delicate balance between discipline and love. Perhaps she saw in Hayley a reflection of what her own child might face in the industry. Or perhaps she simply couldn't bear to watch another young soul swallowed by the machinery she had fought all her life. As production wrapped, The Parent Trap became a triumph. It made millions, won awards, and cemented Hayley's image as Hollywood's most beloved teenager. Yet as applause echoed across the world, a quiet question lingered beneath O'Hara's calm eyes. What happens to a child star once the applause fades? That question would follow Hayley for years. She would go on to work, to grow, to stumble. But the lessons O'Hara left behind would stay intact. Lessons about boundaries, self-respect, and the quiet courage of saying no. The public never saw these lessons. They saw only the smiling duo frozen in their cinematic roles. Yet behind that illusion of perfection, a different story was already unfolding, one of mentorship, resistance, and emotional inheritance. And just as the cameras captured the glow of two faces in perfect harmony, something invisible was happening beneath the surface. A woman passing on a language of survival to a girl who didn't yet know she needed it. Fame has a strange rhythm. It begins like a melody, easy, graceful, irresistible. But as it repeats, the same notes start to echo like a trap. For Hayley Mills, adolescence arrived not as a private transition, but as a performance directed by the world. Every year, the girl who once embodied pure optimism was expected to smile brighter, speak softer, and remain untouched by the very process of growing up. In those years, when childhood and womanhood collided in front of millions, Maureen O'Hara's presence took on a deeper meaning. It was not merely mentorship, it was an act of emotional defiance. She taught Hayley something no contract could promise: how to remain whole in a business that thrives on fragments. Hayley would later recall moments that seemed small at the time but became monumental in retrospect. There was the way O'Hara would take her aside before a scene and say, "Don't let them tell you what the audience wants. Only you know what feels honest." There was the way she spoke about privacy not as secrecy, but as sovereignty. "Your mystery is not a flaw," she'd say. "It's your protection." Behind those words was O'Hara's own history, decades of fending off gossip, condescension, and the constant need to explain herself in a male-dominated world. She knew how swiftly admiration could turn into possession. She had lived through the whispers that followed every assertive woman in Hollywood: difficult, temperamental, cold. And she refused to let Hayley absorb those same toxins so young. The emotional truth of their relationship was forged in these invisible battles, the daily resistance to being molded. On set, O'Hara would often correct subtle details: how close the camera stood, how a line was framed, how a gesture might change the tone of innocence. She did it with surgical precision, sometimes to the irritation of male colleagues. Yet, Hayley understood later that each correction was a shield. Every adjustment said the same thing: this child is not your commodity. There was one memory Hayley couldn't shake a late afternoon near the end of filming. The day had been long. The California heat merciless. A photographer arrived, sent by the studio to capture behind-the-scenes stills for promotion. His instructions were casual: "Hayley, can you tilt your chin up a bit? Maybe unbutton the top of your blouse. Idle catch the light." The words were ordinary, the implication not. Before Hayley could react, O'Hara's voice cut through the air, sharp, commanding, unmistakably protective. "She's a child. You'll take the photo as she is." The photographer blinked, awkwardly adjusted his lens, and moved on. The moment lasted only seconds, but it burned itself into Hayley's memory. No one had ever spoken for her with that kind of clarity before, not as an actress, not as a girl. It was as if O'Hara had drawn a sacred circle around her, one that said, "Here, the image ends, and the person begins." Years later, Hayley would describe it as the first time she understood the difference between being seen and being watched. One fills you with light, the other drains you. After The Parent Trap, Hayley's life became a blur of press tours, premieres, and endless questions about her bright future. But inside, she was changing faster than anyone could manage. The innocence that had defined her career was fading naturally, the way dawn fades into morning. And yet, the world wanted perpetual sunrise. O'Hara, meanwhile, returned to Ireland, taking with her a lifetime of discipline and quiet rebellion. She rarely spoke of Hollywood after that, choosing privacy over publicity. But the imprint she left on Hayley endured like an invisible signature. Whenever Hayley faced the familiar storm of expectation, the pressure to remain likable, youthful, marketable, she would hear that voice again: Your mystery is not a flaw. There's a kind of emotional inheritance that passes between women who survive the same battlefield. It doesn't require confession, it requires recognition. O'Hara had seen how studios could twist affection into exploitation. She understood the loneliness of being admired, but not understood. And when she looked at Hayley so bright, so eager to please, she saw the perfect target for the same machinery that had once tried to control her. The recognition bred something maternal, but not sentimental. O'Hara never coddled Hayley. Instead, she taught her how to stand taller, how to use silence as a form of strength. Don't fill every quiet moment. She told her once, "Let the world come to you." That single sentence became the foundation of Hayley's adult life. Silence was no longer emptiness, it was ownership. Yet protection always comes with a cost. The gratitude Hayley felt was intertwined with confusion. She admired O'Hara deeply, but part of her resisted wanting independence, craving the freedom to make her own mistakes. The teenage ego whispered, "I can handle it myself." But when she did, when she stepped into adult roles and public scrutiny without that invisible shield, she realized how much weight O'Hara had carried for her. In interviews years later, Hayley would speak carefully about the transition. She never called O'Hara a surrogate mother that would have diminished both women, but she admitted that something sacred passed between them. It wasn't love in the usual sense. It was recognition between two souls who understood the cost of performing femininity for the world. The hidden truth wasn't a scandal or a secret meeting or a suppressed affair. It was quieter and far more profound, that Maureen O'Hara had given Hayley Mills the emotional tools to remain herself. In an industry built on control, that kind of gift was revolutionary. When O'Hara died in 2015, Hayley didn't rush to post a tribute. Instead, she wrote privately in her journal, "She taught me that the kindest act a woman can offer another is to help her keep her dignity." For decades, that sentence stayed unpublished, resting in silence. Until now. When Hayley finally shared it at 79, it wasn't to rewrite history or seek attention. It was to honor a truth that had lived in the shadows for too long, that sometimes the most powerful love between women is not loud or visible, but protective, disciplined, and deeply moral. Because beneath the glow of the parent trap, beneath the laughter, the matching dresses, the cheerful soundtrack, there was another film being made. Unseen by cameras, the story of a young girl learning, through example, that kindness can also be armor. In that sense, O'Hara didn't just protect Hayley from the studio, the press, or the public. She protected her from the slow, invisible erosion of self that fame demands, the quiet surrender of authenticity in exchange for approval. And that is the hidden truth Hayley finally decided to tell. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was human. Because in an industry that so often devours its children, Maureen O'Hara did something radical. She let a child remain a child. For most of her life, Hayley Mills thought of Maureen O'Hara as a memory preserved in soft focus, the graceful co-star who had once offered her protection, the symbol of maternal authority that belonged to another era. It was only when she revisited the archives for a documentary about the parent trap that she discovered something she had never known, a revelation buried not in gossip or rumor, but in paper. Inside a dusty Disney file, there was a letter. It was dated August 1961, written in O'Hara's unmistakable hand. The tone was formal, almost businesslike, but the content pierced through time. "Mr. Plate, Disney. I must insist that Miss Mills be given the rest she requires. She is not an adult, nor should she be treated as one. If we are to make a film about family, let us remember she is someone's daughter first." Hayley read it again and again. It wasn't just the words, It was the courage of the gesture. O'Hara had challenged the most powerful man in Hollywood on behalf of a child who wasn't even her own. No one had ever told her. No one had ever dared. In that moment, all the fragments of memory, the small acts of kindness, the silences, the boundaries came into focus. O'Hara's protection hadn't been instinct, it had been strategy. She had quietly taken on the role of advocate, risking her reputation in an industry where actresses who questioned authority were swiftly labeled difficult. The shock wasn't in what O'Hara had done. It was in realizing how deliberately she had hidden it. She had never spoken of the letter, never used it to gain moral credit. She had let Hayley believe her safety had been ordinary, when in truth it had been fought for behind closed doors. In interviews decades later, Hayley would confess that this discovery broke her heart a little, because it meant that, while she had been basking in childhood applause, someone else had been waging quiet battles in boardrooms to protect her right to rest, to breathe, to exist beyond the frame. Hollywood, of course, had no memory for such battles. The studio executives who once dismissed O'Hara's insistence on boundaries later praised her professionalism. The same industry that once accused her of being too outspoken now celebrates her as a feminist icon. But the woman herself, fierce, Catholic, stubborn, compassionate, had never needed the validation. She had done what was right, not what was applauded. That, perhaps, was the greatest shock of all for Hayley Mills, learning that her safety had depended on a woman's willingness to be misunderstood. O'Hara had accepted the label of difficult so that Hayley could remain beloved. She had absorbed the criticism that might have scarred a young girl's career. It was a kind of substitution, a silent exchange of burdens. And Hayley, now in her late 70s, finally understood the price of that protection. She didn't just save me from exhaustion, Hayley said quietly in one interview. She saved me from learning too early how cruel admiration can be. That sentence contains the essence of their story. That love, in its highest form, sometimes means stepping into the fire so someone else doesn't have to. The letter to Disney was not the only one. Another, found in O'Hara's private collection after her death, was never sent. It was addressed to Hayley herself. You have something rare. My darling innocence without ignorance. Guard it fiercely. The world will ask you to trade it for power. Don't. Real power is knowing when to walk away. No one knows if O'Hara ever intended Hayley to read those words. Perhaps she kept them as a reminder to herself, or perhaps she knew time would deliver them when they were needed most. For Hayley, finding that letter decades later felt like hearing a voice from beyond the grave. It was both blessing and burden, a message that made her question how many other women of O'Hara's generation had fought invisible wars so that the next ones could dream freely. The biggest shock was not the revelation of a secret, but the unveiling of a truth that feels nearly extinct in modern Hollywood, that moral strength can be quiet, and heroism can wear lipstick. As the story resurfaced, journalists tried to turn it into sentiment, but Hayley resisted. She didn't want it to be nostalgia. She wanted it to be a warning that every system built on image still depends on someone unseen holding the line of decency. When she speaks about O'Hara now, her voice carries both awe and remorse. I wish I had thanked her properly, she says. But she never asked for thanks. She only asked that I live my life, not as a product, but as a person. And that, finally, is the revelation. The real Parent Trap was never about twin sisters tricking their parents into love. It was about a woman and a girl caught in the illusion of Hollywood, finding, against all odds, a real family in each other, not of blood, but of integrity. When the lights fade and the applause dissolves into silence, what remains of a life spent in front of the camera? For Hayley Mills. The answer arrived not in another role or revival, but in memory, in the rediscovery of a woman who had quietly rewritten the script of her youth. Maureen O'Hara was never cast as a savior. She was too complex for that, too proud, too human. But in a world that often mistakes charm for virtue, she understood something most people in Hollywood never learned, that decency requires courage, and courage rarely receives applause. She saw a child standing on the edge of adoration and stepped forward, not to control her, but to shield her from the cost of being loved too loudly. Hayley often says now that fame gives you everything but space. O'Hara gave her that space to breathe, to grow, to keep part of herself untouched by the cameras. That space became the foundation on which Hayley built an adulthood free from bitterness. It was the invisible inheritance passed from one woman to another, an inheritance not of wealth or fame, but of emotional integrity. In her later years, when asked what she learned from Maureen O'Hara, Hayley does not speak of acting or craft. She says simply, "She taught me that grace is a kind of armor. Grace, not submission, not politeness, but the kind that survives scrutiny without losing self-respect." It was the lesson O'Hara lived by, and the one she left behind. There is something profoundly moral in that exchange, a code of quiet resistance against a world that rewards noise. The real truth Hayley Mills finally told at 79 was not a confession or a scandal, but a reminder that the strongest people are often those who fight without witnesses. Maureen O'Hara's legacy is not confined to her films or her legend as the Queen of Technicolor. It lives in every woman who learned that boundaries are not walls, but acts of love. It lives in Hayley Mills, not the star, but the woman who grew up whole. Perhaps that is the real ending to The Parent Trap, not a reunion between parents, but a reconciliation between protection and freedom. And as Hayley's voice fades into the quiet of that London room, one question lingers, soft and enduring. In a world still hungry for innocence to consume, who will stand guard for the next child under the spotlight?